Paul McCartney once shocked the world when he exploded in an interview, calling out the singers he considered the most vile in Hollywood history. His anger wasn't just casual, it was filled with betrayal, broken trust, and disgust at the industry's silence. And the first name on his list? Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis was once McCartney's idol, but that admiration collapsed when the world discovered Lewis had secretly married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown, back in 1958. For McCartney, it wasn't just disturbing, it was unforgivable. The music industry turned a blind eye. The media stayed quiet, and Lewis still walked around like a celebrated legend. That hypocrisy disgusted McCartney more than anything. Behind closed doors, the truth was even darker. Lewis's marriage to Myra was filled with abuse, control, and nights drowned in alcohol and drugs. McCartney saw it as proof that fame could corrupt, manipulate, and destroy, and the silence of those around Lewis only deepened his disillusionment. To him, Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't just flawed, he was a warning of how low the industry could sink. But Lewis wasn't the only one McCartney placed on his blacklist. The betrayal that cut the deepest came from someone far closer, his own bandmate, John Lennon. On April 10, 1970, McCartney stood before reporters and announced the unthinkable. He was leaving the Beatles. Fans thought it was about money or music differences, but McCartney later revealed it was something far more painful, betrayal from the man he once called his brother. When Paul announced his decision, Lennon publicly mocked him. "Paul has no talent except living off the Beatles." Those words shattered McCartney. They weren't just insults. They were daggers from the person he trusted most. To make things worse, Yoko Ono's constant presence in recording sessions made McCartney feel like an outsider in his own band. He felt Lennon had chosen her over their brotherhood, over the band they had built together. By the time McCartney realized Lennon was done with the Beatles, it was already too late. Lennon's words in a Rolling Stone interview still haunt him. "The Beatles are dead, and Paul is the last to know." To McCartney, Lennon wasn't just a friend lost. He became a traitor who helped destroy everything they had created. And at the heart of it all stood Yoko Ono, the woman McCartney believed had manipulated Lennon and driven the final wedge between them, the name he could never forgive. But why did McCartney believe Yoko had that much power? And how exactly did she play a role in tearing apart the world's greatest band? That's where the story gets even darker. When Yoko Ono entered Lennon's life, it felt like a storm that never stopped. McCartney watched his friend's stable home with Cynthia and their son Julian collapse overnight. What shocked him most wasn't just Lennon's obsession. It was how completely Yoko took over. She sat in the studio during recording sessions, a silent reminder that McCartney no longer belonged. Lennon's personality shifted. He grew distant, cold, like a man under a spell. For McCartney, Yoko wasn't just Lennon's wife. She was the woman who ripped apart his friendship, his band, and his trust in music itself. She didn't just destroy the Beatles, he said. She destroyed everything. The Beatles' golden era ended not with music, but with manipulation. But the pain didn't stop there. McCartney soon clashed with another giant of the industry, Mick Jagger. Jagger wasn't just a rival. He was arrogant, sharp-tongued, and constantly used the press to drag the Beatles down. In 1969, Jagger boldly told The Guardian, "The Beatles are the past. We are the future." To McCartney, it was more than arrogance. It was betrayal. When the Beatles broke up, Jagger mocked them again. "They're dead. We are the creators now." Every word was a knife to McCartney's pride. Jagger didn't just insult them. He fueled rumors, exaggerated conflicts, and used the Beatles' downfall to elevate himself. To McCartney, it was proof of a man who would do anything for fame, even if it meant crushing others. Their relationship never recovered. And just when McCartney thought he'd seen the worst, he encountered someone far darker, Phil Spector, a man praised as a genius, but remembered by McCartney as a manipulator with a gun in his hand. Spector didn't just interfere with the Let It Be sessions, he hijacked them. When McCartney resisted, Spector pulled out a gun and threatened to bury the project forever. It wasn't creative tension anymore. It was fear for his life. And the nightmare didn't end in the studio. McCartney later revealed Spector used intimidation, unfair contracts, and even threats against his family. What began as collaboration turned into extortion. For McCartney, Spector wasn't just a producer. He was one of the most dangerous figures he'd ever faced. But Spector wasn't the final name on McCartney's blacklist. There was still one more man, a shocking betrayal that cut even deeper. For all these reasons, McCartney did not hesitate to call Spector one of the most despicable singers in music history. Not only a talented producer, but also a manipulator and abuser, Spector turned their working days into a nightmare. When McCartney finally terminated the contract and vowed never to work with him again, their relationship ended in fury and betrayal. However, the consequences Spector left behind continued to haunt McCartney for the rest of his life. Even though he won some lawsuits, the mental and financial wounds followed him for years. The story of Spector wasn't just an expensive lesson about manipulation and power in the music business. It was proof that evil figures could deeply harm even those who devoted themselves to art. And although McCartney overcame these hardships, greater challenges still awaited him. The story with Spector was only one chapter in his long and difficult journey, and other figures like the next one in this story were no less vile. Music: Bobby Womack, the wife stealer who left McCartney devastated. The story of Bobby Womack isn't just a stain on his career, but one of the harshest blows Paul McCartney ever endured. In 1969, WAC, whom McCartney once considered a close friend, shamelessly stole Barbara, the wife of their mutual friend, Sam Cooke. For McCartney, it felt like a brutal slap in the face, and what Womack did wasn't just shocking, it was disgraceful and unforgivable. After Sam Cooke's tragic death in 1964, instead of showing sympathy, WAC quietly approached Cooke's widow, Barbara. But what McCartney could never accept was that WAC not only secretly took his friend's wife, but did so right after Cooke's death when McCartney himself was still grieving the loss of his friend. To McCartney, it was shameless exploitation, a level of disrespect beyond forgiveness. What made McCartney even angrier was Womack's nonchalant attitude after marrying Barbara. No apology, no sign of regret. Womack left McCartney drowning in unanswered questions about how a supposed friend could act with such vileness. In an interview with The Guardian, McCartney confessed he didn't just take his friend's wife, he exploited a family's grief. "Whack made me feel like a fool for trusting someone that wicked." These words weren't just disappointment, they were the voice of disillusionment in an industry McCartney once believed in. But Womack didn't just hurt McCartney once. Even after knowing how devastated McCartney was, WAC acted as if nothing was wrong, even defiant. The music industry, instead of condemning him, brushed it aside as if it were normal. No one called him out. No one treated him as the villain he was. McCartney couldn't understand why such a disgraceful act caused no outrage. Eventually, McCartney had no choice but to sever all ties with Womack. He lost not only a friend but also his faith in a part of the industry he had dedicated his life to. This betrayal made McCartney question the values he had built his career on. As he later bluntly said in an interview, "He didn't just take a friend's love, he corroded every value I once believed in music." To call Womack vile would be an understatement. His actions were not just betrayal, but blatant deception in an environment where loyalty should have mattered most. McCartney would never forget the day his closest friend revealed himself as a disgraceful man who preyed on grief for selfish desire. From the disappointment with Bobby "Whack" McCartney then faced another shock, the collapse of another legend, Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley, out of control and consumed by drugs until the end. Elvis Presley, crowned the king of rock and roll, wasn't just a music legend, but a symbol of greatness and success. However, for Paul McCartney, who once idolized Elvis, the singer's final years were a devastating shock. Despite having everything: fame, fortune, and millions of adoring fans, Presley chose a reckless lifestyle, lost control, and fell to habits that destroyed him. What hurt McCartney the most was that Elvis didn't just ruin himself, but dragged others down with him, unwilling to face glory alone. The last years of Elvis's life were a blur of drugs, alcohol, and endless parties. He began using sedatives and painkillers in the 1960s to cope with career pressures, but soon they became indispensable. Before long, he lost all self-control, collapses, failed marriages, affairs with young women. Everything reflected a man unable to govern himself. McCartney felt not only disappointment, but deep pain watching his idol self-destruct. In an interview with the New York Times, he said, "I couldn't accept Elvis's way of life. He had everything and still destroyed himself with his talent. And all he had living like that was an unacceptable self-destruction. These words revealed not just confusion, but the anguish of watching a hero turn into someone unrecognizable. Worse, Elvis dragged others into his downfall. Unable to bear loneliness, he pressured friends and family to share his destructive habits. Stories surfaced of him hosting late-night drug and alcohol-fueled parties, coercing others to join, and even crossing lines of decency. McCartney recalled hearing that Elvis would often demand those close to him to drink and indulge alongside him as a way to keep everyone close. To McCartney, Elvis wasn't just using drugs to ruin himself, but using people as allies in a meaningless fight against loneliness. This not only disappointed McCartney, but also forced him to reflect on the crushing effects of fame. The picture became clearer when McCartney realized Presley couldn't stand people leaving him. His downfall wasn't just about losing control. It was about a man unable to accept isolation, forcing others to share his darkness. McCartney couldn't fathom how someone like Elvis could damage those around him in this way. With all this disgrace, McCartney felt that although Elvis was a music legend, his career and personal life were tragic. Elvis ruled the world, but let that world destroy him, McCartney said in one interview. Looking at Presley's final years, McCartney realized fame didn't always equal happiness. Sometimes its temptations consumed the artist instead. Even after Elvis passed, the secrets and sins he left behind haunted everyone, not only for his addictions, but for the way he pulled others into his collapse. Only a few years later, McCartney faced yet another troubling figure, Keith Richards. Keith Richards, a life of excess and no restraint. On a February morning in 1975, news of Keith Richards' arrest for drug possession shook the music world. Though not his first run-in with the law, this time even fellow musicians grew weary. While the press focused on his talent, Richards became the symbol of excess violence and self-destruction, leaving those around him suffering. McCartney, who once admired Richards' gift, couldn't understand how someone with such potential could live so recklessly. By the late 60s and early 70s, Richards' wild lifestyle had become notorious drug bear and alcohol binges, endless parties, all seen as part of his image. But to McCartney, it wasn't just indulgence, it was vile irresponsibility. One of Richards' most shameful acts was violently beating a colleague to the point of hospitalization without remorse or compensation, continuing as if nothing had happened. McCartney had seen his brutality in private meetings. Many times Richards lashed out physically, leaving McCartney questioning if this was how an artist should act. Beyond violence, Richards was involved in a serious car crash in 1973 while drunk and high. The accident not only wrecked the car, but injured passengers. Keith Richards never apologized, never took responsibility. He lived in the glow of his legend, unrepentant. For McCartney, Richards became a walking cautionary tale, a man who destroyed not just himself, but everyone around him. Disgusted, McCartney cut ties, convinced Richards' recklessness was beyond redemption. But the scandals didn't stop with Richards. Another name haunted McCartney's blacklist: Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, the fraud in the mafia's shadow. There are two kinds of people in this world, those with power and those with nothing. "I'm one of the powerful ones," Sinatra once bragged. For McCartney, this wasn't just arrogance, it was proof of corruption. FBI files later revealed Sinatra's mafia ties, laundering money, coercing producers, and controlling artists through threats and blackmail. Friends like Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin weren't partners. They were pawns under his influence. McCartney despised Sinatra's abuse of power. He controlled everything. "I can't respect someone like that," he told The Hollywood Reporter. To him, Sinatra wasn't a legend, but a manipulator hiding behind the mob. And yet, even Sinatra wasn't the end of McCartney's disgust. Another star earned his fury, not for power games, but for how he treated women. Tom Jones, the womanizer who disrespected everyone. Tom Jones was adored for his voice, but infamous for his reckless affairs. Parties where he juggled multiple women at once. Rumors of flings with Brigitte Bardot, Priscilla Presley, even Catherine Zeta-Jones. To McCartney, it wasn't charm, it was exploitation. Worst of all, Jones cheated openly on his wife, turning his marriage into a public scandal. McCartney, who valued loyalty and respect, couldn't forgive it. In an interview, he cut deep. Jones doesn't know how to respect women. He only uses them to maintain his fame. I can't respect someone like that. For McCartney, Tom Jones became proof that talent means nothing without dignity. His disgust turned into permanent distance. And so, from Richard's recklessness to Sinatra's mafia ties and Jones's shameless scandals, McCartney's list of the worst reveals an ugly truth. Even legends wear masks. But do these stars really deserve their fame? Or has history been too kind?